The first thing I registered was the silence. The classroom, typically buzzing with student chatter, was empty. The only sound was the faint echo of footsteps in the distant hallway. I checked the clock on the wall. School had been out for a while. Everyone was gone. Everyone except me and Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins had been my history teacher for the past 2 years. He wasn't just a teacher, he was a storyteller, breathing life into the curriculum. His passion was infectious, and students were drawn to his charismatic, approachable nature. I was no different. But lately something had shifted between us, an unspoken tension I couldn't quite define. "James, could you come over here for a minute?" His voice broke through my thoughts. He sat at his desk, scribbling something on a piece of paper. I hesitated, my heart quickening as I approached. There was something in his tone, something that sent a wave of unease through me. "Sure," I replied, standing awkwardly by his desk, the silence heavy between us. "You've been distracted in class," he observed, looking up at me with those intense blue eyes. "Is something going on?" I froze. I hadn't expected him to ask something so personal. Yes, my mind had been wandering, but it wasn't because of school. It was because of him. The way he spoke to me, the way he looked at me, like I was more than just a student. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination, but now, alone with him in the empty classroom, I wasn't so sure. No," I stammered, my throat dry. "I've just had a lot on my mind." Mr. Collins didn't reply immediately. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, his gaze lingering a beat too long, making me feel scrutinized, like he was searching for something hidden beneath my words. "You know, James," he said after a moment, "you can talk to me if something's bothering you. You don't have to keep things to yourself." There it was again. That tone that implied this conversation was about more than just school. I shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. The last thing I wanted was to discuss what was really on my mind, because what I'd been thinking about wasn't something I could admit to. He stood, walking around the desk to stand directly in front of me. My heart pounded. He was too close, closer than a teacher should be. I could feel the heat radiating off him, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "I appreciate it," I mumbled, avoiding his gaze, "but everything's fine." Mr. Collins didn't move. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Are you sure? You don't seem fine." The air crackled with tension, thick and heavy. My palms were sweating, my heart hammering in my chest. Something was happening, something I didn't know how to handle. He was pushing, and a part of me, a part I wasn't proud of, didn't want to pull away. My voice faltered, and I took a step back, needing to create some distance. But my body betrayed me. Instead of moving, I remained frozen, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to acknowledge. Mr. Collins's hand brushed against mine just for a second, but it was enough to send a shockwave through me, enough to make my breath hitch. I pulled my hand back instinctively, but he didn't seem fazed. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice soft, coaxing. "We're just talking." But we weren't just talking, and we both knew it. The way he was looking at me, the way he stood so close, it was clear this was something else, something dangerous. I should have left. I should have walked out right then. But I didn't. I stayed. "I'm not afraid," I lied, my voice shaky. I could barely meet his eyes now, the intensity of the moment overwhelming. "Good," he replied, his lips curving into a small smile. "Because there's no need to be." He stepped closer, closing the gap between us, and my breath caught in my throat. My mind screamed at me to move, to say something, but all I could focus on was how the room felt smaller, how the space between us seemed to vanish. "I've noticed you watching me," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "In class. It's okay, you know. You don't have to hide it." My stomach flipped. This was it, the moment I had both dreaded and secretly craved. He was acknowledging the unspoken tension that had simmered between us for weeks, maybe longer, and now that it was out in the open, I didn't know what to do. I started, but he cut me off, his hand brushing against mine again, this time lingering. "You were," he said softly, his eyes locked on mine. "And that's okay." The tension was unbearable now, a suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I felt trapped, not just by the classroom walls, but by the situation itself. I didn't know how to escape. "Mr. Collins," I said, my voice trembling, We can't, but he didn't step back. Instead, he moved even closer, his hand now resting lightly on my arm. The touch sent another jolt through me, and I hated how my body reacted, how I didn't instantly pull away. "Why not?" he asked, his voice calm, almost soothing. "We're both adults. We don't have to pretend anymore." My heart raced, my thoughts a jumble of confusion and desire. This couldn't be happening, but it was. And the worst part was, a part of me didn't want it to stop. I stood frozen as Mr. Collins leaned in closer, his breath warm against my skin. And in that moment, everything changed. The air felt thick. Mr. Collins's hand rested on my arm, light yet deliberate. Tension buzzed through me, a disquieting mix of fear and an unnamed desire. My breath hitched in my chest, the gravity of the moment pressing down. This was wrong, undeniably wrong. Yet a part of me couldn't resist the pull towards him. "We shouldn't be doing this," I managed, the words barely audible, my body a traitor to their meaning. He remained close. His grip tightened slightly, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent my heart racing. "James," he said softly, his voice low and persuasive. "You don't have to pretend. I know you felt it too." I swallowed hard, ignoring the growing knot in my stomach. This wasn't right. I was his student. He was my teacher, my mentor. Now everything was distorted, the lines of right and wrong blurred beyond recognition. "I don't know what you're talking about," I responded, though my voice lacked conviction. My muscles coiled, ready to flee, yet my feet were leaden. His gaze softened, and he took a step closer, his body mere inches from mine. The proximity made thought difficult, my focus narrowed to his overwhelming presence. "It's okay, James," he whispered, his hand sliding up my arm, sending a shiver through me. "You don't have to fight it." I shook my head, unable to speak. I didn't want to fight it. There was something about this, about him, that made me feel vibrantly alive. It was dangerous, thrilling, and terrifying all at once. "I don't want to get in trouble," I muttered, my voice trembling. "You won't," he reassured me, his hand now resting gently on my shoulder. "No one has to know." Closing my eyes, I tried to shut out the reality of the situation, but his words had taken root. The urge to give in was overwhelming. I felt his breath on my neck, his presence looming, and suddenly, the tension broke. I don't know what possessed me, but I turned to face him, my breath coming in ragged gasps. His eyes were darker now, filled with an emotion I couldn't decipher. He leaned in slowly, giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. And then his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft, tentative, as if testing the waters. But the moment I responded, it deepened. His hands were on me, pulling me closer, and I found myself melting against him. The world faded away until there was only him. The moment I kissed him back, everything shifted. His hands pulled me closer, and I melted into the kiss, the world dissolving until only he remained. I should have resisted, pushed him away, but instead I clung to his shirt, drawing him nearer, consumed by the moment. A fire ignited between us, primal and unstoppable, growing hotter and more intense with each passing second. We stumbled backward, our bodies entangled, crashing against the desk behind us. The edge of the wood dug into my back, but I hardly noticed. All that mattered was him, his touch, his breath, the urgent pressure of his lips against mine, making my head spin. He broke the kiss, his forehead resting against mine as we gasped for air. "James," he breathed, his voice thick with desire. "Are you sure?" I didn't answer with words, pulling him back to me, my lips crashing against his with a hunger I hadn't known I possessed. There was no going back. We'd crossed a line, and we both knew it. His hands were everywhere, my back, my chest, my hips, exploring me with a desperation that mirrored my own. I could feel the heat radiating off him, our bodies pressed together, my pulse racing. Every touch, every movement sent a jolt of electricity through me, leaving me craving more. We moved together in a frenzy of passion, driven by something beyond logic or reason. The room blurred around us, the boundaries of teacher and student dissolving as we surrendered to the moment. Time seemed to stand still as we crossed that final threshold, the world narrowing to just the two of us. It was raw, intense, utterly unlike anything I had ever experienced. My body moved in sync with his, each touch igniting a fire within me that refused to be quenched. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. We lay tangled together, our breathing heavy and ragged, the reality of what had just transpired sinking in. A knot of guilt tightened in my chest. I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and I didn't know what to make of it. Mr. Collins was the first to move, pulling away slightly as he sat up. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, but his expression was calm, almost serene. He looked down at me, his hand brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure if I was. Physically, I was fine. Emotionally, I was a wreck. What we'd done felt intense, powerful, yet undeniably wrong. He seemed to sense my hesitation, leaning down to kiss me gently, his lips soft and reassuring. "It's going to be okay," he whispered, his voice soothing. "You don't have to worry." But how could I not? We'd crossed a line, and everything felt different. I didn't know what this meant for us, for me, for the future. All I knew was that something had irrevocably changed. We sat in the aftermath, the silence heavy with unspoken words. The weight of our decision pressed down on me, and for the first time, I wasn't sure I could face the consequences. "James," Mr. Collins said softly, breaking the silence. "We'll figure this out, okay? You don't have to worry." I nodded, though unease lingered. I trusted him more than I probably should, but I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to become much more complicated. The following days felt surreal, like walking through a dream I couldn't escape. Every time I saw Mr. Collins, my heart pounded, my mind replaying the memories of that day. I couldn't look at him the same way, yet I couldn't stop thinking about him. Guilt gnawed at me, but it was intertwined with a desire for more. It was wrong, I knew, but the pull between us was too powerful to resist, and every time I caught his eye, dark with the same unspoken longing, I knew he felt it too. Things escalated again on a Friday afternoon. The school was nearly empty, most students gone for the weekend. I found myself lingering outside his classroom. I told myself I was there to ask about an assignment, but deep down, I knew the truth. I stood outside his door, my hand hovering over the handle, my heart racing. This was madness. But before I could talk myself out of it, the door opened, revealing Mr. Collins. "James," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I was hoping I'd see you." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening as I stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing in the empty room. I wanted to talk about the assignment," I stammered, my voice shaky. He didn't buy it, and neither did I. His eyes locked onto mine, dark and intense, the tension between us thickening. "Is that really why you're here?" he asked, his voice low, almost teasing. I couldn't answer. My throat was dry, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I wanted to deny it, to pretend nothing had changed, but that would be a lie. Without a word, he crossed the room, his footsteps slow and deliberate, stopping inches away. The heat radiating off his body, the air charged with a suffocating tension. His hand reached out, brushing lightly against my arm, sending a familiar shiver down my spine. "You've been thinking about it, haven't you?" he whispered, his voice soft but insistent. I couldn't deny it. I'd been thinking about him, about that day, every single moment since. And now, standing so close to him, I couldn't suppress the desire for more. I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he cupped my cheek, his thumb brushing gently across my skin. The gesture was so tender, so intimate, it made my heart skip a beat. "You don't have to know what to do," he said softly. "Just let go." And then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, I leaned in. Our lips met in a slow, heated kiss. The world seemed to fall away. My body responded instantly, my hands reaching for him, pulling him closer as the kiss deepened. There was no hesitation this time, no second guessing. I wanted this. I wanted him. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me against him as the kiss grew harder, deeper, consuming. My heart raced, my breath coming in ragged gasps as our bodies pressed together. The heat between us intensified with every touch. We stumbled backward, crashing into the desk, but neither of us cared. The need, the desire, was too powerful. There was no turning back. His hands roamed over my body, exploring, teasing, sending shivers of anticipation through me. I gasped as his lips left mine, trailing down my neck, each kiss a jolt of electricity. My fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer as he moved lower, his hands sliding under my shirt, his touch sending my breath hitching. "James," he murmured, his voice thick with desire. "I've wanted this for so long." I couldn't respond, my mind spinning, my body on fire. His hands were everywhere, my chest, my back, my hips, igniting a blaze within me. And then, before I knew it, we were moving together, swept away by something inevitable yet impossible. Clothes were discarded, forgotten in the heat of the moment. I found myself lying back on the desk, exposed and vulnerable, completely at his mercy. Yet I felt no fear, no uncertainty. All I felt was him, his touch, his breath, the urgent press of his body against mine. His lips returned to mine, kissing me deeply as his hands roamed over me. I lost myself in the sensation, time blurring, the boundaries between us dissolving as we surrendered to the moment. It was raw, intense, unlike anything I had ever known. Every touch, every movement, sent waves of pleasure through me, leaving me craving more. He gave it to me, willingly. We moved together in a frenzy of passion, our bodies tangled, the heat between us overwhelming. His breath was hot against my skin, his hands exploring every inch of me. I felt myself on the edge of something I couldn't quite grasp. And then, as suddenly as it began, everything exploded in a blinding rush of sensation. My body arched against his, my breath coming in short gasps as the intensity washed over me, leaving me trembling and breathless. For a moment, everything was still. The only sounds were the rapid beating of our hearts and the soft rustle of clothes as we pulled ourselves back together. I lay there, catching my breath, my body tingling, my mind a chaotic mix of guilt, desire, and confusion. But all I could focus on was him. Mr. Collins stood close, his eyes locked on mine, a slow, satisfied smile playing on his lips. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, almost tender. I nodded, unsure how to process what had just happened. Physically, I was fine. Emotionally, I was adrift. What we'd done felt powerful, overwhelming, but also dangerous. I'd crossed a line I never thought I would, and everything felt different. He seemed to sense my hesitation, leaning down to kiss me gently, his lips warm and reassuring. "It's okay," he whispered, his hand brushing against my cheek. "You don't have to worry. No one will know." But I wasn't so sure. I trusted him, yet the weight of our secret was heavy. I stood up slowly, pulling my shirt back on, my mind racing. I knew I'd made a choice, one I couldn't undo. But as I looked at Mr. Collins, I couldn't help but wonder what came next. The days following were agonizing. Every time I entered his class, my stomach churned with regret, guilt, and a persistent desire. The memory of his hands, his lips, the fire between us, haunted me. It wasn't just the memory. It was the constant presence of our secret, a weight I carried everywhere. It was wrong, but I didn't want it to stop. That terrified me. I avoided him as much as possible, taking different routes to class, sitting in the back, and bolting as soon as the bell rang. But it didn't matter. Every time our eyes met across the classroom, I felt the pull, the magnetic tension that had drawn us together. And every time I told myself this had to end, that I couldn't bear the weight of this secret any longer. It was suffocating me, trapping me in a web of deceit. My friends noticed the change, asking if I was okay. I shrugged them off, lying easily, pretending everything was fine when it was anything but. How could I explain something like this? It all came to a head one evening after school. The building was nearly deserted, the halls quiet and still. I was in the library trying to focus on homework, but my mind kept returning to Mr. Collins, to what had happened, to the unanswered questions that plagued me. Was this a mistake, or was it something inescapable? The sound of footsteps made me look up. My heart skipped a beat when I saw him standing there, his expression unreadable. "James," he said softly, his voice carrying its familiar weight. I tensed involuntarily. "Mr. Collins," I replied, trying to sound neutral, to ignore the pounding of my heart. But composure was impossible in his presence. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a reminder of everything we'd done and everything we hadn't talked about. "We need to talk," he continued, stepping closer, his eyes fixed on me, trying to read my thoughts. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "About what?" "About us," he said plainly, his voice steady, but with an edge. The same edge that had been there before, when everything changed. "I know you've been avoiding me." I glanced down at my hands, trying to steady my breathing. "I haven't been avoiding you." He sighed softly, sitting across from me at the library table. "James, you don't have to lie to me. I understand what's going on." I wanted to deny it, but the truth hung between us, a heavy silence. He was right. I'd been avoiding him, yet the attraction remained as potent as ever. "I don't know what to do," I confessed, my voice a mere breath. "I don't know how to make sense of any of this." Mr. Collins leaned forward, his arms on the table, his gaze fixed on mine. "We're in a difficult situation," he stated carefully. "But you need to know I never meant to hurt you. This wasn't premeditated." A lump formed in my throat, the weight of our actions pressing down. "But it happened," I replied, my voice trembling. "And now I don't know how to live with it." He reached across, his hand lightly touching mine. The contact sent a familiar yet unsettling jolt through me. "James," he said, his voice low and intense, "I need you to understand something. We're both in this together. You're not alone in how you feel." His words caught in my breath. He'd voiced the very fear I'd harbored, that I wasn't alone in this, that we were both bound to this secret, inextricably linked. "I'm scared," I whispered, meeting his eyes. "I don't know what's going to happen next." For the first time, I noticed a shift in his expression, a softening, a vulnerability. "You don't have to be scared," he said gently. "We'll figure this out. Together." But how could we? I wanted to believe him, to trust we could navigate this mess. But the reality was overwhelming. Guilt, fear, and an unshakable desire warred within me. "I don't know if I can do this," I murmured, my voice barely audible. Mr. Collins's grip tightened slightly, his eyes darkening with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. "James," he said softly, "you're stronger than you think. We've crossed a line, yes, but that doesn't mean we have to be defined by it." I stared at him, my heart pounding. His words were meant to soothe, but they only intensified my confusion. How could we not be defined by this? How could we pretend things were normal when we'd crossed an irrevocable boundary? "I don't know how to pretend," I admitted, my voice shaking. "You don't have to pretend," he said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "You just have to trust me." But trust was the very thing I wasn't sure I could offer him anymore, not after what had transpired, not after everything had changed. He rose slowly, his eyes still on mine. For a moment, I thought he would leave. Instead, he walked around the table, stopping beside me. He took my hand again, this time pulling me to my feet, drawing me towards him. I didn't resist. I couldn't. The tension between us had reached a breaking point. The world seemed to fade as I stood inches from him, my breath catching as his fingers brushed my cheek. "James," he whispered, his voice low and charged with an emotion I couldn't define. "This doesn't have to be the end." Before I could reply, his lips were on mine again, just as before, slow, deliberate, filled with the same heat and urgency. My body reacted instinctively, leaning into the kiss, my hands clutching his shirt, pulling him closer. Thought was impossible. All that mattered was the feel of his mouth, his hands sliding down my arms, encircling my waist. Each touch ignited a shiver, my heart racing. We stumbled backward, his hand guiding me towards a private study room. The small space enveloped us as we crossed the threshold, the door clicking shut. I barely registered it, lost in the heat of the moment. His hands were on me, pulling at my clothes, and I responded without hesitation, my body moving in sync with his. It was frantic, desperate, as if we both understood this was our only chance, the release of everything we'd held back. We moved together in a whirlwind of passion, our bodies colliding with breathless force. His hands roamed, exploring, teasing, and I surrendered to the sensations, every nerve alight with the intensity. Time seemed to stop. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only him, his touch, his breath, his body pressed against mine with dizzying urgency. Then, as abruptly as it began, it ended. We stood entangled, the silence heavy with the weight of our actions. My chest heaved as I struggled to breathe, my mind reeling. Mr. Collins pulled back slightly, his hand still on my waist, his eyes dark and unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air crackled with the unspoken acknowledgement that we'd crossed yet another line, one from which there was no return. "I don't know what to say," I whispered, my voice barely there. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face, his expression softening. "You don't have to say anything. We'll figure this out together," he said gently. But the truth was, I had my doubts. What began as a lapse in judgment had morphed into something far more complex, far more perilous. Standing there, the weight of our actions pressed down on me like an inescapable storm. His hand lingered on mine a moment longer before releasing its hold. Yet, even as the physical distance between us grew, the tension remained, a palpable force in the room. I turned towards the door, my heart still pounding against my ribs. Stepping into the hallway, I knew nothing was truly over. No matter how far I walked, the truth would shadow me, a constant reminder of the tangled path we'd taken.